Okay, hello friends. Welcome to the Chabura and to an exciting public shiur titled Of Monarchs, Minyanim, and Mitochondrial DNA, where we will draw on Torah, history, and culture, and see connection between the British monarchy and a wide array of relevant medical and halachic topics. Leading us in today's fascinating shiur is Rabbi Dr. Eddie Reichman. About our speaker, Rabbi Dr. Eddie Reichman is a professor of emergency medicine and professor in the Division of Education and Bioethics at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine of Yeshiva University, where he teaches Jewish medical ethics. He received his rabbinic ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University and writes and lectures internationally in the field of Jewish medical ethics. He has been a mentor of the Medical Ethics Society of Yeshiva University since its inception. His research is devoted to the interface of medical history and Jewish law. His most recent book is titled The Anatomy of Jewish Law, published by Magid. We're very pleased to be having Rabbi Dr. Reichman with us, as well as to be co-hosting this lecture with the Torah Refuah Institute, and we welcome their audience. Thank you all for being here, as well as those who will be watching later. Thank you so much, Rabbi Reichman, for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. A tremendous pleasure and schus to be with the Chabura and the Torah Refuah Institute. I have tremendous admiration for both of your organizations. They truly inspire me, and not only the substance and material that I learned, but in the methodology of harnessing modern technology to really disseminate Torah so widely. So it is really a tremendous schus to be joining you today. I'd like to share with you a talk that I've developed very recently, entitled Of Monarchs, Minyanim, and Mitochondrial DNA, Jews, Medicine, and the United Kingdom, an homage, as we say in America, or an homage, if you will, to Queen Elizabeth II and to King Charles III. I must confess, my affinity for Queen Elizabeth II starts some years ago when I was a child, and I went to visit London, and I saw that we actually share the same initials, ER. So I must have a few hundred pictures of myself with post boxes and the fences at palaces that have her initials. Furthermore, as I grew older, my clinical practice of medicine is actually ER medicine, which for those of you in the United Kingdom, that's emergency medicine. You have A&E, I think you call it, not ER. But for us in the United States, my clinical practice is ER. Hence again my continued relationship with Queen Elizabeth II. What I'd like to do today is put together for you some fascinating chapters dating back many hundreds of years that establish the relationship between Jews and medicine and the United Kingdom. Some of them you will be familiar with, some of them I suspect you will not be familiar with. Some of the connections are very clear and obvious. Some of the connections, you will excuse me, are a little bit tenuous, but I hope they will be fascinating nonetheless. One interesting connection with King Charles is the fact that King Charles underwent a circumcision back in 1948, which I suspect all of you are familiar with. His mohel was an Orthodox Jew whose name was Dr. Jacob Snowman. Dr. Jacob Snowman. Let's see if actually I'm just going to go off screen for a second. Dr. Jacob Snowman, in addition to being a mohel, probably the most prominent mohel in the Orthodox Jewish community at that time, is also the author of this little volume, which is called A Short History of Talmudic Medicine, which I happen to have in my library. I only recently found out that he was the mohel for King Charles. I was not aware of that previously. This little volume is a collection of from the classic works of Julius Preuss and Yehuda Leib Katz-Nelson, who are authors in the field of biblical and Talmudic medicine. As to whether the royals in general undergo circumcision, you yourselves in England may have read from the Jewish Chronicle about a month ago 2 months ago, why are male members of the royal family circumcised by a Moel from January 10th? And there's been this long-standing debate. That's not really our discussion today. Some say it goes back to Queen Victoria. Be that as it may, it was relatively recently debunked, and I'm not sure if this is a definitive article or not, by Robert Darby and John Kozigen, entitled "The British Royal Family Circumcision Tradition, Genesis, and Evolution of a Contemporary Legend." So they debunk the myth, at least in their opinion, of the royal family continuing circumcision, or if there's any Jewish association with that circumcision. But I'd like to go back a few hundred years, start back in the early 15th century, with one of the monarchs in England, and King Henry IV. Henry IV, in the early 1400s, became ill. And none of his physicians were able to cure him. So he heard of a very prominent physician in Italy whose name was Elias Sabato. This physician, Elias Sabato, happened to be a Jewish Orthodox physician. Parenthetically, he treated popes and princes and royalty in Italy. And he sent a communique to request his presence in England. And Elias Sabato had one particular request, which has been preserved in the archives. And that request is, I pulled out the relevant phrase for us, that he would only attend to King Henry IV on the proviso that he could bring with him cum decim omnibus servientibus. That he could bring with him, and for those of you who are well versed in Latin, he could bring with him this number of male servants, decim male servants, which means he wanted to bring with him 10 male servants. Now, why would you think that Elias Sabato would want to bring with him 10 male servants? So I think you can guess. He wanted to bring with him a minyan in order to be able to pray, in order to have a minyan for davening. So the question is, was there no minyan in England at that time that he could gather? So the obvious answer to that is the Jews had been expelled centuries earlier, and in fact, there was no minyan, at least of professing Jews in England at that time. So he literally had to bring his own minyan. I often wonder, and I'm open to suggestions if anyone has any theories, why he specifically asked for 10. He could have asked for 9. After all, he would make the 10th person. So my theory is, and I encourage you to make your own suggestions, that since he would probably be attending to the king a fair amount of time, he would leave his minyan without a minyan. He would leave his 9 servants without a minyan, so as they would have a minyan even if he left and spent a good portion of his time at the palace. He requested specifically that he bring 10 as opposed to 9. As we move forward through the monarchy, by the way, you'll see it might help to know a little Shakespeare, as many of the monarchs we will be discussing have plays that were written by Shakespeare about them. Richard III has a very interesting connection to Judaism, and in particular to contemporary Jewish medical ethics. And in this connection, admittedly, is a little tenuous, but the concept is utterly fascinating, as we'll see in just a moment. Richard III ruled for a very short period of time. Shakespeare also wrote a play about him, as you well know, and he described his physical habitus: foul, bunchback-toed, deformed, unfinished, etc. And in fact, there was, and you'll see that it no longer is the case, but the Richard III Society a number of years ago claimed that in fact Shakespeare had inappropriately maligned Richard III, and they maintained that he was not deformed in any way. And they maintained many people's image of Richard III is influenced by Shakespeare's portrait of the poisonous bunchback toad. But in fact, if you look at the portraits, they show no sign of deformity. So this debate raged for quite some time. And in fact, if you were a tourist, like I was a number of times in England before 2010, 2011, and you were looking for the burial place or the grave of King Richard III, and you would have asked your tour guide to show you his burial location, you would not have been you would have been disappointed, because no one knew where Richard III was buried until recently. And what transpired in the early part of the 2000s, people began to do research to try and determine where Richard III would have been buried. And one of the areas that they suspected was near an old church, very close to the battleground where he's purported to have died. And with some archaeological research, they identified an area which was underneath a parking lot in Leicester. And they began to dig there, and they found the remnants of the church, and they also found the remnants of the cemetery. And they looked in the area of the cemetery, which is designated for people of great honor, and they found the following skeleton. This is the skeleton to your left. In situ, this is how they discovered it in the cemetery. So you will notice the skeleton, and if you take a close look at the skeleton, I apologize if it doesn't come out so well on the screen, but I drew a red line so you can see. A red line is where the spine is. This is his cervical spine, and then his thoracic spine and part of his lumbar spine begin to curve quite significantly. And then we return back to the lumbar spine, which is in relatively straight position. So the skeleton that they found had severe kyphoscoliosis, which would be consistent with someone who is hunchback. Furthermore, in the skeleton, they found some severe head trauma. This is a huge hole in the occipital area, the posterior part of the head of the skull of this skeleton that they found, and Richard III is purported to have died on the battlefield from massive trauma, including head trauma. Just an interesting tangent. You shouldn't be confused between this, which is a hole in the skull, or in Yiddish, a Lachenkup, I guess. Not sure the relationship between these two. And these kinds of skulls. And the reason I mention this, you'll see in a moment. If you go to many museums of anthropology or medical history, you'll oftentimes see these skulls which have holes in the skull. These were not made by the curators in order to organize their collections. These are actually holes that were made in the skull since antiquity, and they in a procedure which is called trepanning or trephining. It was done for a variety of reasons, probably for people who suffered either from seizure disorder or from psychosis, to release the spirits. But you can see that people survived the procedure because there is bone growth in the skeleton subsequent to the boring of the hole. And you may have picked up just a few weeks ago, this was, I believe, the Times of Israel, they discovered a trephined skull in Megiddo in Israel, or Megiddo. A square hole in an ancient skull, Middle East's earliest brain surgery found in Israel. And this trephining, we have record from thousands of years ago. It's one of the earliest known surgical procedures in the history of medicine. I bring it to your attention also, not only because they found such skulls in Israel, and you shouldn't get confused that Richard III has a trephined skull, but also because it appears in the Mishnah, the text of the Mishnah, reference to trephining. The Mishnah accounts not for our discussion today, but the Mishnah discusses skulls that are mitame, that convey impurity, either by touch or from being under the same enclosure called tumat ohel. And a deficient or missing skull does not convey impurity through an ohel, through an enclosure. But what is considered deficient? How much has to be missing from the skull in order to render it no longer impure through tumat ohel? So Beit Shammai says kimlo makdeach, the size of a makdeach. What's a makdeach? Be'ezo makdeach amru bikatan shel rofim. So makdeach is a drill to make a hole in the skull, and this is a later example of a trephining drill. And the size that a small trephining drill of the physicians, that size hole, that would eliminate the tumat ohel from the skull if it was missing that amount. But in any case, they identified the skull and the skeleton, which, for all intents and purposes, contextually, historically, seemed to be that of King Richard III. The question is, how could you confirm this today in the 21st century? So doing a genetic analysis on the skeleton would be nice, but if you don't have anything to relate it to, if you don't have family to relate it to, then it's not going to identify it specifically as being Richard III. So what they did is the following. They did a different form of DNA testing called mitochondrial DNA testing. What's unique about mitochondrial DNA is that it is transmitted exclusively maternally from mother to child. It can actually be transmitted to the male children as well, but the male children do not transmit it further. So it's a maternally transmitted gene. So what they did in an extraordinary act of genealogy is they identified two living relatives who were related to the mother of King Richard III. And they tested the mitochondrial DNA of the skeleton and the mitochondrial DNA of these two living relatives. And here's the results. In 2012, a skeleton was excavated. Here we report the DNA analysis of both the skeletal remains and living relatives of Richard III. We find a perfect mitochondrial DNA match between the sequence obtained from the remains and one living relative, and a single base substitution when compared with a second relative. So basically, a near perfect mitochondrial DNA match between Richard III's DNA and the DNA of his matrilineal maternal descendants of his mother living today, which is basically a confirmation that this was indeed Richard III's skeleton. He was reburied with an honorary burial in church in Leicester. But how is it relevant to us? It's relevant to us in the following fashion. And I'll share with you a scenario which hasn't transpired yet, but will probably transpire in the next few decades. And the scenario is as follows. You have here I'll put in the context of the United States, but I guess it could be equally in the United Kingdom. A boy brings home a girl for the holidays from university, and he says to his parents, Mom and Dad, I have good news and I have bad news. I found an amazing young woman. She's definitely the right one for me. Unfortunately, however, she happens to be Catholic. However, she did a cheek swab and she sent it for DNA testing, and it turns out that her mitochondrial DNA is an exact match to the mitochondrial DNA of an Orthodox Jewish Rebbitzin, rabbi's wife from 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So the question is, if she is an exact mitochondrial DNA match, biologically that tells us that she is a maternal descendant, bas achar bas, a maternal descendant to a woman who is known to be Jewish. So could she, take her cross and switch it out for a Magen David Jewish star and go to synagogue the next day, and she's 100% Jewish? So the answer is indeed. That may be the case because she is genetically, biologically Jewish. Of course, we'd have to address some of the halachic ramifications of this. Now, we don't have that kind of scenario today. Like I said, I suspect we will see that in the not too distant future. What we do have is the following: we have a number of Jews, large populations of Jews that are coming to Israel, that are not known to be specifically Jewish. Who are those people? The Russian population. From the former Soviet Union. And when they want to marry in the state of Israel, they have to prove Jewishness. Many of them have no archival information to prove their Jewishness. They don't have a rabbi, local Orthodox rabbi, that can confirm their Jewishness. They don't have any graves that show their relatives. There's no documentation, etc. So what researchers are doing today is researchers are doing mitochondrial DNA testing on many thousands of Jews throughout the world. And they have identified certain mutations, certain unique elements of the mitochondrial DNA that seem to be found exclusively in the Jewish population. So the question is this mitochondrial identification sufficient to either exclusively serve to identify these people as Jewish, or perhaps as at least supplemental or corroborating evidence in rendering someone Jewish? And this is a reference to work, Biruri Yahadut, which was published a few years ago, which has multiple articles on the topic. But this is the relevance of Richard III to contemporary modern halacha, and the rabbis to this very day are still debating this issue. Moving on to our next monarch, Henry VIII, Yibum, or levirate marriage, and Jewish physicians. And by the way, I am not embarrassed to be corrected by those of you who have much greater knowledge in British history than I do. Feel free to correct me in the chat. Feel free to correct me during the lecture, after the lecture. But in this particular scenario, the reason why this is relevant to Jewish medical history and to Jewish history, interestingly, is the marriage of Henry VIII to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. So Henry VII wanted to marry his family to establish an alliance with Spain. So Ferdinand and Isabella at that time of infamy in Jewish history had a daughter whose name was Catherine. So he married his son Arthur to Catherine. Arthur was an ill man, and he died very shortly thereafter. So then the question was, Henry VII, wanting to retain the alliance with Spain, had a creative idea and a challenge with respect to maintaining the alliance with his family in Spain. He suggested that Henry VIII, his other son, marry Catherine of Aragon. But what was the issue? The issue was, according to the Catholic Church, it might be prohibited for Henry VIII, who became Henry VIII, to marry Catherine of Aragon. Why? Because the Bible says, "Ervas eishes achicha lo segale, ervas achicha hi," that a man is not allowed to marry his brother's wife. It's a biblical prohibition against marrying your brother's wife even after the brother dies. But on the other hand, there is one unique scenario where not only is it permitted, it is actually obligatory for the brother to marry his brother's widow. And what is that scenario? That's the scenario of levirate marriage. And that's in another pasuk, in another phrase in the Bible, where it says, Ki yeshu achim yachdav u'meisach ad mihem, one brother dies, ubein ein lo, and he dies childless, which was the case with Arthur. Lo siye eishes amesachutza, his widow shouldn't be married to someone else, a stranger. Rather, she should marry his brother. The ceremony or the procedure of levirate marriage. So in that case, with discussion with the Pope, they decided that they would invoke levirate marriage, and this way Henry VII could maintain his alliance with Spain, and who became Henry VIII, married Catherine of Aragon. The problem is that a number of years later, she did not bear him a male heir, and he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn at that time, or to have children with Anne Boleyn at that time. So he was looking for a way to dispense with Catherine of Aragon. So what he did is he actually revisited this prohibition of eishes ach, of marrying your brother's wife, and said that perhaps when I married Catherine of Aragon, it was inappropriate for me to marry Catherine of Aragon. In halachic terminology, he wanted to be mafkia, the kiddushin, the mafreya. He wanted to revisit and say, maybe I was wrong. Maybe that decision was wrong. Maybe levirate marriage is only for the Jewish population, not for the non-Jewish population. And in fact, my marriage to Catherine of Aragon should be null and void. And there's much more discussion, not for this forum, but perhaps at another time. So where does he turn for advice or discussion about levirate marriage? He turns to the Jews, because the Jews know a lot about this. Where does he go? He goes to Italy, or he sends messengers to Italy. Again, because there are no Jews in England at that time. The Jews had not yet returned. The Jews had been expelled from England centuries earlier and still had not returned. So here you have, and this was an article written by the Chabad rabbi in Oxford called Henry VIII, Oxford's Hebraists and the Rabbis. And here he writes, Rabbi Chalfon was the Rav chosen by Richard Croke, Henry VIII's legal advisor, to interpret biblical law to justify an annulment. Rabbi Chalfon claimed that due to the prohibition of eishes ach, Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine was null and void, since Jews no longer observed the mitzvah of yibum. He based his opinion on the psukim in the Torah. But another physician, by the way, in those days, this was the times of the Renaissance, the rabbis, many of the rabbis were physicians. And these two major consultants of different advisors of Henry VIII were both rabbis and physicians at that time. Another physician and Rav disagreed with him completely. He was Yaakov ben Shmuel Montino. And Pope Clement VII, there was a different pope now, by the way, than the one that had allowed Henry VIII to marry through Yibum. Clement VII had consulted Montino, who decided against Henry. So there you have an interesting relationship between Jewish medical history and Henry VIII. Parenthetically, in the course of this debate and discussion, someone informed Henry that the Jews have an entire tractate, two entire tractates in their Talmud that deal with the divorce. One tractate is called Gittin, and another tractate called Yevamos, which deals entirely with levirate marriage. So perhaps you'd be able to glean some information, it was told to Henry. So as the story goes, Henry said, "Send me this Talmud. I would love for my advisors to consult the Talmud." So apparently he sent away to Daniel Bomberg, who at that time was a great printer, and many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this story. And Daniel Bomberg, in fact, created what was the very first complete printed Shas from his famous printing press in Venice. And some of you, or many of you, probably know the story of Jack Lunzer's acquisition. Jack Lunzer, a famous collector in England, his acquisition of this famous so-called Henry VIII Shas. He was in the Victoria and Albert Museum some decades ago, and he happened upon a volume. The exhibit, by the way, was a history of Anglo-Jewish art and history to commemorate the readmission of the Jews to England under Cromwell, and actually found online. The exhibit was in 1956. This is the exhibit catalog from the Victoria and Albert, where Jack Lunzer had initially attended. And in that exhibit, there was a volume that was labeled as Biblio Rabbinica, Biblical Bible, Rabbinic Bible. And Jack Lunzer appreciated it. In fact, was not a Bible, but was actually a volume of the Talmud. So he went to the curator and found out that it came from Westminster Abbey. And he went to the sexton of Westminster Abbey and said, "Do you have any more such volumes of this Talmud?" And he said, "Yes, we have an immense, we have feet of dust caked up upon these volumes." So Jack Lunzer said, "I'll send my team in to help clean it up for you." And he sent in his team, and he said, "You don't need these. I'll be happy to take them off your hands." And he tried for many years to purchase them, and to make a very long, fascinating story short, one day he was flying from Sierra Leone, as he tells the story, viewing some diamond mines, and he saw that the charter for Westminster Abbey was actually either being auctioned or some issues with the charter of Westminster Abbey. So he immediately made some phone calls and acquired access to this charter of Westminster Abbey. And once he had that in hand, then he called the sexton of Westminster Abbey, and as he tells the story, he said, when the sexton, or the shamus, so to speak, picked up the phone, he said, "Mr. Lanza, we've been expecting your call." And he actually bartered this chart of Westminster Abbey for the famous Shas, the Henry VIII Shas. The provenance of that Shas is debated. It's not clear whether it's the original Henry VIII Shas or not. Be that as it may, after Jack Lunzer passed away, it was sold. That Shas was sold for $9.3 million. Parenthetically, the Valmadonna Trust collection has some other gems in the world of Jewish medical history. One of them you may not appreciate has anything to do with Jewish medical history, and that's an incunable. Incunable, for those of you who are not familiar with the world of printing, refers to books printed before the year 1500, which are exceedingly rare, incunabula from the so-called cradle of printing, the infancy of printing. And Jack Lunzer had more incunabula than any other private collector by far, and more incunabula, Hebrew incunabula, than most libraries in the world. One of them was a book called Nofet Tzufim, or Nofes Tzufim, which was written by Yehuda Messer Leon. This book is famous in printing history because it's the first Hebrew book published in the lifetime of its author in the late 1400s. But what you may not know is that Yehuda Messer Leon was a very prominent and famous physician, and he also apparently taught at the University of Padua in northern Italy. And this particular work was a work on rhetoric, and one of the stated intentions of the work was actually to train young Jewish medical students in exercises and in the field of rhetoric, to familiarize them with this concept of thinking and writing and reason, which would help them in their training at the University of Padua to become physicians. What we also find in the Val Madonna Trust is an extraordinary collection of broadsides. Broadsides, for those of you who go to Israel, pashkeval is the term for these posters that are waxed up on the walls of Jerusalem. But they had these broadsides which were put on walls in Italy or handed out as leaflets or sheets at events, and they are called ephemera because they many of them didn't survive. And the Val Madonna Trust or the Jack Lunzer collected hundreds of these broadsides on many different topics, including marriages and funerals and other Jewish rites. But one area which I first discovered when I saw the Val Madonna Trust collection here in New York, when it was sold or attempted to be sold at Sotheby's famous auction house, or put up for sale. It was not sold then. I saw this very item, which really piqued my interest and put me on a journey for the last many years. And this item on the left is in the center of this slide, is a broadside in honor of a person by the name of Solomon Lampronti. Solomon Lampronti is the son of the more famous Yitzchak Lampronti. Yitzchak Lampronti was a giant in Italian Jewish history, the author of a work called Pachad Yitzchak, the very first halachic encyclopedia ever written. He, the father, was a graduate of the University of Padua, famous for accepting Jews to practice medicine, the only university at that time to do so. And this poem was written in honor of the graduation of his son, Solomon Lampronti. And it turns out that the Val Madonna Trust has around 13 or 14 such poems, a unique genre of poems written exclusively for the Jewish medical graduates of the University of Padua. This is not British history, this is Italian history, but I've spent many years tracking down similar poems, in addition to the 12 or so from the Val Madonna Trust collection. I have thus far identified over 100 examples of poems written for Jewish medical graduates of the University of Padua. And actually, parenthetically, I'm speaking on a Zoom next week to a Jewish Italian physicians group in Italy on the relationship of Italian history and the Jews in medicine, and we'll be focusing on the history of Padua, which has a very rich history. Jack Lunzer's collection, some of it was sold, the high ticket items were sold, but much of it, thankfully, was donated to the National Library of Israel. National Library of Israel, for those who are not familiar, has built this new spectacular building. I don't believe they've moved into the building yet. They will be moving in very shortly, but the building will be housing his extraordinary collection. For those bibliophiles amongst you, the new National Library, which you're seeing a picture of the stacks of the National Library. So the inner stacks, where most of the books will be held, will be completely humanless, completely contactless. You are looking at the stacks. It's hard to see, but there's a crane in the center of this picture. When you order a book, it's like pushing a button on a soda machine or a candy machine, or an Amazon. We in America have Amazon warehouses where they have these kinds of technologies. All the books are kept in crates of the exact same size, and it'll find that crate for you and bring it to you. And the concept of walking through the stacks will be largely a thing of the past. Moving on to our next monarch, Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of Henry VIII. Henry VIII, and I believe his second wife, Anne Boleyn. What relationship does she have to do with with Jewish medical history and Jewish medical ethics? So it turns out that Elizabeth I's main physician was a man by the name of Rodrigo Lopez. Rodrigo Lopez was Jewish. Now he had converted to Christianity, but it was debated, and still remains debated to this very day, if he was a genuine convert to Christianity, or whether he was a converso, someone who maintained his Judaism in private, but overtly kept his Christianity. In any case, there was tremendous jealousy about Rodrigo Lopez, and most likely because of his Jewish origins. He was falsely accused of attempting to poison the queen, and here you see an illustration of that. Lopez compounding to poison the queen, and in fact, he was put on trial and he was convicted for poisoning the queen. I believe he sat in the Tower of London, and his execution, he was executed at Tyburn, where most of the executions took place at that time. His last words when he died, when he was executed, his last words before he was executed are purported to have been, "I love the Queen as much as I love Jesus." And that phrase to this very day is still not fully understood. Maybe Yevon, you can appreciate. Now, someone wrote a very interesting article on the bottom here, Dr. Rodrigo Lopez's last speech from the scaffold at Tyburn, saying that he didn't actually say, "I love the Queen as much as I love Jesus." He said, "I love the Queen as much as I love our Lord." And when he said our Lord, he wasn't referring to Jesus. Our Lord, to him meant our Lord, his God, the Jewish God. So be that as it may, he had a Jewish physician, but there's more of a connection. The connection is the following. Returning to Shakespeare for a moment, Shakespeare, another one of his plays, and even for those Jews who are not familiar with most of Shakespeare, most Jews are familiar with one play, and that's The Merchant of Venice, for the famous Jewish character Shylock. So the question often arises, if indeed there were no Jews in England at the time that Shakespeare was writing, what could he have used as a template or a model to create a Jewish character? So some have suggested that, in fact, the Queen's physician, Rodrigo Lopez, was his model for the Jew that he created in The Merchant of Venice. Now, that Jew wasn't a physician. That Jew was a moneylender, and that was correct. Many of the Jews were moneylenders. And fascinatingly, Jews were restricted to certain professions in this period of time. Money lending was one of them, and being a physician, ironically, because that gave the Jews an immense amount of power, ironically, a physician was one of the few things that Jews were allowed to do at that time. But in any case, the text of this play also raises unique questions which are relevant to a contemporary debate about Jewish medical ethics. So you're all familiar with Shylock lending money to Antonio, and he says, as collateral, if you default on your loan, I want a pound of flesh. So as it turns out, Antonio defaults on his loan. So Shylock comes to claim. And he says, "The pound of flesh which I demand of him is dearly bought. 'Tis mine, and I will have it. If you deny me, fee upon your law. There is no force in the decrees of Venice. I stand for judgment. Answer, shall I have it?" So the question is, if this were a halachic debate, would it in fact be permissible for Shylock to claim a pound of flesh as collateral and to collect on that and to in fact procure a pound of flesh? What's the relevance of this to contemporary Jewish medical ethics? The relevance is to organ donation. are you allowed to sell your body? Can you sell your body? And even before the organ donation debate, the whole concept of who owns your body was entertained in a fascinating essay by Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin, who is the first editor of the Encyclopedia Talmudit. And in his work called L'Or Halacha, he has an entire essay called Mishpat Shailak Lefi HaHalacha, and analyzing the character of Shylock and the concept of selling parts of your body or ownership of your body. And here's what he concludes. He goes, Borur efo she'im Shylock ba b'tabeas ba'alei din l'kayem misahit chayvut ein beis din nizkakin lo. Says it's patently obvious and clear to me from a halachic perspective that if Shylock came to the local beis din and claimed his pound of flesh from Antonio, that the beis din would not accede to that request. Lo Shylock, lo baldin, rishaim lachtoch basar min achai. Neither the beis din, neither the court of the judicial court, nor Shylock had any right to slice a piece of flesh off a living being, neither from themselves nor from others. And he goes on to say that the body belongs to God, that we are baileys, we are guardians of the body, we do not own our bodies. And consequently, there is a debate today about our ownership rights and our ability to sell. Let's say I wanted to donate a kidney to somebody. Could I ask for compensation for that? So this is a lengthy discussion, but a fascinating one. And the conclusion, by the way, in contemporary Judaism, is that while in fact we don't believe we own our bodies, and we agree pretty much, although there's some debate on the issue, we agree with the conclusions of Rabbi Zevin that we do not own our bodies and cannot technically receive compensation for something we don't own. Yet the compensation in organ donation is configured in a slightly different way. There, the compensation for organ donation is not receiving money for the kidney, which you are claiming ownership rights over, but rather you're receiving compensation for lost wages, for medical bills, etc. And with very, very few dissenting opinions, the overwhelming majority of rabbis today would say that it is permitted to receive compensation for donating an organ. Of course, that has to be weighed against whatever the legal aspects are of organ donation in your particular time. Let me share with you a few chapters where England figures significantly in the responsa literature. Continuing on our theme on the influence of the British Kingdom on Jews and medicine and Jewish medical ethics. For those of you who are even remotely familiar with the world of Jewish medical ethics, in particular the topics of autopsy and organ donation, the one we just mentioned a moment ago, the starting point for the discussions is a responsum from the late 1700s by Rabbi Chezkel Landau, who was a rabbi in Prague, one of the great rabbinic decisors, one of the great rabbinic authorities in late 18th century Prague. And the question that was posed to him was the following. Aldas Kuntreso Asher Shalach Elai, regarding this letter that was written to me, Benidon Hashe'ela, regarding the question, Shaboilav, that came to me from Mikehila Kedosha, London. Where did this question derive from? This question was from the city of London. And what was the case? The case was the very famous tshuva, the Nodi Yehuda, actually originated in the city of London. And what was the case? Regarding someone, read in the English of your patient who fell ill with a, quote, stone in the bladder. And the physicians operated on him as per the customary treatment of this condition. They were not successful, and the patient died. The sages of the city were asked if it was permissible to dissect the body to determine the cause of illness and death, so that the knowledge could be used to better treat future patients with the same condition. It is interesting, the stone in the bladder, if I were to ask you, what do you think a stone in the bladder is? You might say, gallstone, you might say kidney stone. The truth is it was related to the kidney stone, but slightly different. The actual condition that he was talking about was a bladder stone. is a stone found in the urinary bladder. Now, bladder stones today are much, much rarer than they used to be. Bladder stones used to be exceedingly common. Bladder stones are exceedingly painful, as opposed to a kidney stone, which is found in the ureter, which is measured in millimeters. Stones that form in the urinary bladder can be measured in inches and grow to the size of a softball. And for those of you in London, if you go to the Hunterian Museum or the Science Museum, I believe it's on the second floor where they have exhibits on medicine, you'll invariably see bladder stones from the 18th century, exactly around the time that the Noda B'Yehuda was writing, and the question came from London. And they're huge, they're massive. And because they're massive, they don't exit the body, they stay there, they cause infection, they cause intermittent obstruction, extraordinarily painful. So in any case, surgeons were trying to figure out a way to properly operate on these. Parenthetically, we talked about trephining as one of the earliest surgeries known to mankind. Cutting for the stone, the bladder stone, is also one of the very few early surgeries of medical history. We have records in the first, second century of the Common Era for descriptions of bladder stone surgery. So it's been going on for thousands of years. We've actually talked about the main surgeries today from antiquity. Circumcision was also surgery in antiquity, one of the very few. Trephining, cutting for the bladder stone, those are the very few surgical procedures from antiquity. Here's some examples of these stones on the upper left-hand side. Here's the doctor speaking to the patient, says, "You've got gallstones, kidney stones, and bladder stones. Welcome to the Stone Age." But just to give you an idea of how things were in that period of time and the risk for this surgery, this is a picture actually of Frère Jacques, Brother Jacques. Now, I suspect many of you are familiar with the children's song, Frère Jacques, dormez-vous. So that song is about a historical figure, Brother Jacques, who had a religious epiphany later in his life, but before he became religious, he was a wandering lithotomist. Lithotomist is one who cuts for the stone. Why was he wandering? Because his mortality, not his morbidity, his mortality rate was around 50%. So wherever he operated, he had to leave relatively quickly because a good portion of his patients were going to die as a result of the surgery. So they were experimenting on surgeries at that time, at the time of the Noda B'Yehuda. And at the very time of the Noda B'Yehuda was writing, around that time, was one of the great surgeons in London, was a man by the name of William Cheselden. And here is a report of his work. This is from Philosophical Transactions. Keep in mind that in those days, Philosophical Transactions was a medical journal. This is from 1746, a remarkable case of a person cut for the stone in a new way, commonly called the lateral. So it's possible that William Cheselden or the likes of William Cheselden were experimenting with new surgeries for cutting for the stone and requested from this Jewish family if they could do an autopsy so they could see if their surgery was correct and perhaps to benefit others. What was his conclusion? His conclusion was he could only do the surgery if someone would directly and immediately benefit from this procedure. That responsum has laid the groundwork for discussions about autopsy and organ donation today, and is still the major precedent for organ donation. And organ donation is allowed, you're allowed to harvest organs from someone who is considered legally, halachically dead, which itself is a separate discussion because of the definition of brain death and what the halachic issues are relating to brain death. But leaving that aside, assuming the person's halachically dead, however that's to be defined, you're only allowed to harvest that if the organ can be used for direct and immediate life-saving benefit for somebody else, which today is the case for heart transplants and liver transplants and lung transplants, etc. We talked a little bit about Shakespeare. Let's take a look at Shakespeare's epitaph and see how that epitaph interfaces with British history and Jewish medical history. Shakespeare's epitaph reads as follows: says, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones. So imagine, of all the things Shakespeare decides to write on his epitaph, what does he write about? He writes about grave robbing, writes about nobody disturbing his bones. How does this relate to Jewish medical history? So grave robbing, because anatomical dissection became popular really in the early 1500s and onwards in medical training, and they didn't have enough bodies, they would often remove bodies from the graves, so-called grave robbing or body snatching. These are in the United Kingdom. Actually, these types of metal protectors for coffins to prevent grave robbing. Here's an advertisement from the Wooler's British Gazette from 1822. Many hundred dead bodies will be dragged from their wooden coffins this winter for the anatomical lectures, and for those who deal in the dead, and for the supply of the country practitioner and the Scotch medical schools. The question of the right to inter in iron is now decided. The violation of the sanctity of the grave is said to be needful for the instruction of the medical pupil. But let each one about to inter a mother, husband, child, or friend say, shall I devote this object of my affection to such a purpose? If not, the only safe coffin is Bridgman's patent wrought iron one, charged the same price as the wooden one and superior substitute for lead. So these are the kinds of ads that you would see. They devised, even this is a torpedo coffin, which had a torpedo which would explode if a person tried to disturb the coffin. And much of the history of grave robbing and the end of grave robbing took place in England. The expose occurred when these two people, Burke and Hare, who famously had an inn in England where the derelicts and the prostitutes and the would often come and spend the night, and they would actually murder them and provide the bodies for the medical school, and they get a certain amount of compensation for that, and hence the expression "Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knox the man who buys the beef." So Professor Knox, who's a prominent anatomist at that time, he used to buy bodies from both Burke and Hare. And to burk, by the way, if you look in the dictionary, to burk, the verb is to suffocate somebody, and that's burking. That's how they used to suffocate their tenants and provide the bodies. How does this interface with the Jewish community? And I'm looking at the clock here, so we'll close in 5 minutes, and I'm happy to answer questions for anybody who has questions. This is a ticket which was given to someone at the Great Synagogue in the late 1700s as a reflection of their civic duty at that time. And what is this ticket? It says, you see most of it's printed and some of it's left. It's from the Beit Knesset Hagadol, the Great Synagogue in London. And the ticket was issued to a man named Shlomo Schneider. And if you look at the border, you'll see it's a skull and crossbones. And what is this? What does this ticket reflect? It says, Shmo Allah B'Goral, you have been chosen by lottery, you Shlomo Schneider. Leilech lishmor bebeit hachayim dekilosenu, to stand guard in our community at the cemetery. Beit hachayim is a euphemism. The house of life refers to the cemetery. On Yom Hey, which is Thursday, Parshas Shoftim, Tafkuf Nun Hey, I think 1795. Min Gluck 8 from 8 o'clock in the evening until Gluck 7 until 7 o'clock in the morning. And if you don't want to do it, you have to get someone to cover your shift. And if you don't get someone to cover your shift, you doctors can appreciate the concept here. If you don't get someone to cover your shift, then you have to pay a hefty fine. And this notion of grave robbing affected the Jewish community. And here you have from the London Times, February 10th, 1800, a Mr. Abraham Di Matos Mocato, the Jew broker, died a few days ago, directed that his grave may be watched for 12 months, and he bequeathed 200 guineas to be divided amongst 3 men appointed to that duty. So that was very common. Actually, just now, I sent off to the London Metropolitan Archives from the Spanish-Portuguese shoal about some grave robbing they had in their cemetery, and I'm awaiting some documents from that. So I will close with this last chapter, and apologize that there are others we couldn't get to today, perhaps at another time. And this is one you may be familiar with. This is the iconic Jeremy Bentham, the auto icon of Jeremy Bentham, which sits to this very day in University College London. This is the old Jeremy Bentham in the dark wooden enclosure case, beautiful wooden case. Today it's in a more open glass case. But Jeremy Bentham, who was a utilitarian philosopher, actually donated his body specifically for dissection because he wanted to show that he believed that the body could be used after death for positive purposes. There weren't enough bodies. That's why they had to do grave robbing. By the way, I failed to mention the reason why the Jewish cemeteries were often grave robbed is not for any anti-Semitic reason. It's because the Jews buried quickly and the bodies were fresher for the dissection table. Fascinating fact. But in any case, how does this interface with the Jewish community? His head began to decay, by the way. This is the original head, which used to sit at his feet. So they made a wax head, and Madame Tussaud, who's pictured down here, is the one, she herself actually made the wax head for Jeremy Bentham. But how does this interface with the Jewish community? It actually entered these responsa literature. The responsa literature, Dayan Grosnas, a prominent rabbinic judge in London, was asked a question about the presence of that body in University College, and he wrote, Nishalnu me Kohanim shehem Talmidei Universita. I was asked from a number of people who are Kohanim from the priestly tribe. Sorry about that. If they can walk into the halls of the university, because does this body convey tuma? Now, we talked about tumat ohel with respect to trephining. So he was asked the question, if a Kohen is allowed to walk into the building of University College in order to study, not even studying medicine necessarily, although many people did study medicine at University College, but just to train there. And he actually says that it would be permitted under certain circumstances, and has a very lengthy analysis about the laws of Tuma. But in any case, I'm just going to pass through to our last slide. And again, apologize, we couldn't get to some of this today, perhaps another time. But just to close off, to bring it to the modern era, through a Jewish history, the very founder of modern Jewish medical ethics was one of the former chief rabbis of England. And that is Rabbi Emanuel Jacobowitz, who passed away in 1999. And he was not only knighted by the Queen, but he was made a peer a number of years later. And this is his work, Jewish Medical Ethics, which was his dissertation from University College, that same college we just talked about, where Jeremy Bentham's body sits. And so ends our discussion about the interface between Jews, medicine, and the United Kingdom. And just to conclude on a personal note, the Jewish medical connection to the United Kingdom continues for me personally, because the hospital that I work at is called Montefiore Medical Center, named after Moses Montefiore, who was a great benefactor for many causes, including many medical institutions. So I thank you for the opportunity to join you today. And if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to entertain any questions about either what we talked about or anything related to Judaism and medicine.
Ephraim.
Yes, I just wanted to say, Elia Sabato. Do you have a tradition that it is Sabato? Because if it is a Spanish tradition, I think it would be Sabato. If it is Italian, it would be Elia Sabato.
Good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I will look into it.
There are people in the Campania region that have a first name Sabato, and they are not Jewish. For example, there was a theorist of race who was, even after the World War, was a professor at the University of Rome of biology. but he was for cultural racism, diverse issues during the racial laws, and his name was Sabato Visco, even though he was not a Jewish. It is just part of Campania outside Naples that have some non-Jews who have that name.
Very interesting.
He said in Philadelphia, there was a very famous acting minister. He was an ordained rabbi, but didn't want to be considered a rabbi. And his first name was Sabato in the 19th century.
Very good. I'll have to look into it, Nissan.
Thank you.
Ephraim.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. So thank you so much for joining us. I highly recommend you check out our website at thechabura.com and also to check out the Torah Terefua group, which is a forum providing medical professionals access to senior poskim and those with experience in the field of medical halacha. Thank you so much, Rabbi Dr. Reichman, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you. My pleasure. Real zchus.
And we hope to have you many more times with us. Laila tov, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Call too. Laila tov, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.